Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Last night was the second night of the Republican National Convention. We're not going to spend as much time tonight and today talking about it, but we will, of course, talk about it a little bit as we go along, but want to also take some time to educate you about a couple of issues. And one of the topics we're going to be talking about in the first hour is this whole area of education. And this is going to be important, but especially kingdom education. What do we mean by that? I thought last night, even as we were hearing from Governor Chris Christie and Donald Trump Jr. and Ben Carson and so many other individuals, the issue of schools came up, and this is what Donald Trump Jr. had to say.
The other party gave us public schools that far too often fail our students, especially those who have no options. Growing up, my siblings and I, we were truly fortunate to have choices and options that others don't have. We want all Americans to have those same opportunities. Our schools used to be an elevator to the middle class. Now they're stalled on the ground floor. They're like Soviet-era department stores that are run for the benefit of the clerks and not the customers, for the teachers and the administrators and not the students. You know why other countries do better on K through 12? They let parents choose where to send their own children to school. That's called competition. It's called the free market. And it's what the other party fears. They fear it because they're more concerned about protecting the jobs of tenured teachers than serving the students in desperate need of a good education.
Gives you just a little bit of an idea of what was said last night, and we're going to spend some time in this first hour here talking about alternatives to education. And if you have listened to this program for some time, we've of course expressed a real concern about the public schools. But even today, I think we're also going to be talking about some of the concerns we have even in what are oftentimes identified as Christian schools. Do we appreciate them? Yes. These are, in some respects, what you might call from a biblical point of view, wounds of a friend. We really believe that we should educate our children in godly education, but sometimes we certainly have some questions about how effective it has been. To get us thinking about this, we have in studio with us again a good friend of the ministry, Tracy Eckert, co-founder and director of Storehouse, which again is a house of prayer which has live worship and prayer sets 5 days a week, 2 weekly equipping services, a school internship program, and a fully functioning ministry. And she's been on the program with us talking about many issues. Today, we're going to be talking about the subject of education, aren't we?
Yes, and I couldn't be more thrilled and more passionate about this subject of education, especially having 7 kids of myself and having a lot of personal experience with what doesn't work and what does work.
Yeah, and you had 7, some were in the public schools, some were in the Christian schools, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. But let me also introduce by phone, joining us, Sandy Woods. She is the teacher and administrator of the Comenius School of Creative Leadership. We're going to be talking more about that in just a minute. But Sandy, thank you for joining us by phone.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Let's, if we can, Tracy, maybe tell your own story for just a minute. I've heard you speak on this, so I thought it would be appropriate to recognize that whether you put your kids in the Christian school or homeschool them or public school, parents still need to take control of their children's education. And sometimes when we look at the educational product that is produced, we're rather disappointed. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's more than a fair statement. Again, my own experience is I have 7 children, and they all went through the educational system. And at first I thought the public educational system would be a great resource for us. Of course, we're already paying our tax dollars, so we're hoping to get the benefit of it. But what I found is that over the past, 20 years, I've seen such moral decay in the public school system, and I've seen almost a left-wing agenda of trying to take out of my children everything I'm trying to pour in the values of Christ and the values of just being a good civic leader, in my children. They're trying to take all of that out. And so I felt like I was kind of in a war all the time, trying to preserve the values that I'm trying to instill. And so that was the first thing. The second thing, so we took them and put them in Christian schools, and in the Christian schools we found that while I had great morals and values, what they lacked is they were trying to over-educate my kids, and so my children were under so much stress that every night they were going to bed crying.
Yeah,
and they were falling
lots of homework and all sorts of stuff.
Oh my goodness, the homework was 11 p.m. and through the weekends, and so through that process they had no family life. They had no opportunity to really dream anymore. And so we found that didn't work. And so then we took a lot of our kids out and we started homeschooling them. But I'm a working mom, and my husband, I run a church, and my husband, he works full time. And so that has its own challenges. And if anybody out there is a homeschool mom, there's a lot of stress involved with, am I doing it right? Yeah. And so, I had heard about 7 years ago about this Comenius School of Creative Leadership in Fort Mill.
Right.
And it just really, like the Holy Spirit just really highlighted it to me. And so I began to do some research. And what I found was almost like an oasis of fresh air, fresh water, and was so pleasantly surprised and almost wanted to shout from the mountaintops about what I found, as far as there is something out there that is working, and the children are so happy and prospering in it. Not just academically, but they're prospering in their souls. Yes. They're prospering in their spirits. And so I was just really excited today because we're building one in Dallas, and we're bringing one here in Dallas, and I wanted to share that with your listeners.
Well, and again, listeners around the country might want to know more as well. Of course, people in Dallas could even think if their kids or grandkids want to go to it. But again, just to reemphasize what you said, and then we'll talk with Sandy in just a minute. When you look at what has happened over the years, I think of being in ministry now 40 years, and I've spoken many times at ACSI, the Association of Christian Schools International, and you think about the teachers I've spoken to, you think of the conferences I've gone to, you think of all the students in the Christian schools, then you think of the homeschool events that I've done, and then you think of all the Christian camps that I've spoken at over these years, and I just think, where are those individuals? Because we should be having just a mass of Christian 20-somethings, 30-somethings in these churches, because they've been getting some of the best education we can provide in the Christian schools and the home schools. They're going off to camps. They come back excited, and yet they seem to have really adopted a cultural view, and a lot of them aren't going to church. Most of them don't necessarily have a biblical worldview. And so I think it's fair to say, I think you agree with me, that what we've been doing just isn't working. And so this is why we wanted to focus on this and recognize that wherever your children are right now, or your grandchildren, whether they're in the public schools, the Christian schools, or they're being homeschooled, of course, parents have a responsibility. Ultimately, God's going to hold us responsible for what we educate our children about. But at the same time, we're going to come back and find out a little bit more about the Comenius School for Creative Leadership and its approach. We're going to give a little bit of history, and then, of course, give you a chance to join the conversation. We need to take a break, though, and if you say, I'd like to know a little bit more about what we're talking about today, of course, we have information about both Tracy Eckert and Sandy Woods, and we have a link to the website there. You also have a video to watch, and, of course, you can go to ComeniusSchool.com. But if you don't know how to spell it, good news is we already have a link for you to find it there. Let's take a break. We're going to talk more about this new alternative and how it might apply to your children and grandchildren right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, 2 weeks ago, the Dallas police used a bomb disposal robot to end the standoff with the cop killer. Does this unprecedented use of a police robot signal a change in the way technology will be used to fight crime in the future? I think that it does. Police departments have been willing to embrace any technological advance that keeps officers safe and helps them be more efficient in fighting crime. A GPS, cameras, and laptops can be found in almost every squad car. Now that the cost of military-grade robots is dropping, it's likely that many police cars in the future might have a robot. Now, the argument for doing this is straightforward. Military-grade robots now are used by bomb squads and are used to keep police and citizens away from danger, either a suspected bomb or a dangerous suspect. Attaching a bomb to a robot was probably the next logical step. On the other hand, there is a concern that I have written about in the past about the militarization of the police. Many of the robots are similar to and even identical to the ones used by the military. Of course, they're very expensive, so it's unlikely they'll be used too often to blow up suspects. It is possible that the use of these robots can save lives. A robot operator can stay a safe distance from a suspect and tell him to drop a weapon. If he fails to comply, a robot could be used to bring non-lethal force like a taser. In many scenarios, it would be hard for an officer to use a taser, especially if the suspect already has a weapon drawn. Fortunately, the police robot ended the confrontation in Dallas without any other officers being killed. Its success guarantees that other police departments will consider using police robots for other such confrontations. That is why we need a debate and a discussion about the use of police robots. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about an educational opportunity, and if you would like to join our conversation a bit later, we'll open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. In studio, Tracy Eckert, and also by phone, Sandy Woods, who is a teacher and administrator at the Comenius School of Creative Leadership. And Sandy, let me come to you for just a few minutes. I guess some people are saying, I've never heard the word Comenius before. It's John Amos Comenius, but tell us a little bit more about him and about the philosophy of the school that you have actually put together.
I would love to. John Amos Comenius was a Moravian bishop who lived in the 1600s, and his philosophy of education was that all children should be educated, and at the time, really only rich young men were the ones who could afford to be educated, but he thought that women as well as men should be educated, rich and poor, and he also believed that the family was really important, and so education should always be the parents' responsibility. So at our school, we kind of bow to the parents, and they're the primary teachers. We're not a homeschool co-op. We are a school. However, we do rely on the parents to really, for us to support them. And so our school takes the point of view that homework is absolutely outlawed. There is no assigned homework. That doesn't mean that there's no work. Students still have to study for tests and quizzes and complete projects, but there's no assigned homework such as do 20 questions at the back of the book. And this allows family time after school to do what you really are passionate about. And if it's education, you can go home and study some more.
You know, and it's interesting that he at the time referred to the schools as slaughterhouses of the mind. if that was true in the 17th century, you can imagine what he would be thinking of the 21st century, because we have already heard from Tracy talking about the fact that, especially in the public school system, sometimes you feel like you're pouring things into your kids, and then they go off to school and they're just taking them right back out. And you have just an incredible challenge. And even as she pointed out a minute ago, with some of these schools where you have so much homework, there's never a chance for the parents to really interact with their kids, because the only way they're interacting is helping them getting their homework done before they all head off to bed, don't you think?
Yes, and I've actually heard that as an opinion, that this was a good way for parents to know what's going on in the school. And I just think that's horrible. Parents can come and help out at the school. They can ask their children about what they've learned. They really don't need to be helping them with homework. And so any work that would be assigned for homework is actually done in the classroom with the teacher, who can actually help and correct and guide.
You know, Sandy, one of the things I've heard Tracy talk about, but you can speak to it as well, is we today take for granted that everyone should be educated, but that was a controversial idea. And some of the other ideas of Comenius were so controversial that they were finding his manuscripts and burning them and all sorts of things that you can't even imagine. But in this world today, where a lot of the people in public education say that really children are the wards of the state, they're not really the parents' responsibility, you can see how even these ideas that were first proposed in the 17th century are getting pretty controversial here in the 21st century. Absolutely.
He's really current. And he is actually called the father of modern education. So we have this unknown Moravian bishop who really foresaw what children needed. He's one of the first people actually to put pictures in textbooks.
Wow.
He believed that the Bible was the first and primary textbook, but nature was the second. And so one of the things is to get kids out of school, outside the four walls, and into nature for inspiration, but also to see how things work. Even Jesus used parables of nature and farming to drive home points to his disciples and those who were listening to him.
Well, one of the things I oftentimes say that I love about Christian camps is it really puts both elements of creation together, both elements of revelation together, the revelation in God's Word with the revelation in God's world. And again, as an individual that loves nature and also sees how, in many cases, some of the most significant decisions individuals have ever made have taken place in a Christian camp, I think lots of times that's because we get them out into nature. And for young people that grow up not even knowing some of the basic rhythms of life and nature, you can see how, of course, Jesus used those in his parables.
Absolutely. I could not agree more.
Let me come to Tracy for just a minute, because Tracy, this was sort of an epiphany for you where you are sort of searching for ideas, and all of a sudden, I don't know how this got into your hands, but tell us a little bit about that all of a sudden you said, this is the answer. This is what we've been looking for.
The gospel. Jesus came, he preached the gospel of the kingdom, right? He didn't preach the gospel of salvation. He said, salvation will bring you into a place of the kingdom. And I came to tear the veil so that you could get to me. And so having a kingdom school is different than having a Christian school, in that it's not just we're going to teach you the word, but we're going to teach you about accessing the author of the word, the living word. And so teaching them how to navigate that. And this is what Comenius said. He really believed that classrooms should be workshops of heaven, and they should reflect heaven, meaning that we should teach our kids, okay, we've run into a difficult situation, or we've run into a problem. It's either behavioral or it's academic. Okay, what are we going to do about that? Well, let's pray. And that's what I loved about going to Comenius and seeing these kids. They solve problems by first going to the man who has the answers, because Comenius was teaching that schools are we're not there to just give kids information, but we should be training them in wisdom.
Yes.
And that's heavenly wisdom. And so I was watching this and seeing how all of these children were so happy and so prosperous because when they run into a situation or a problem, they pray and they ask the Lord for the solution, and the solution comes, and all the kids work together towards that solution in unity. And so it's just a great cooperation between the faculty, between the students, in the Holy Spirit and in love. And it works. It's a model that works.
Sandy, what I'm hearing here is, first of all, the cooperative aspect of that, which is certainly important, accountability, working together, being part of the body of Christ, the prayer aspect of that as well, and certainly the importance of recognizing that there is the totality of life. It's not just what actually happens in the classroom. Is that kind of the philosophy there of the Comenius School?
It is. We believe that kingdom education is primarily about bringing children to the Lord. You know, he said to let the little children come to him, and that's all of us. We're all his kids. And so the primary responsibility for us as educators is to bring the children to the Lord. So if there's a problem, why not point them to the Lord and say, hey, he has the answers. Get with the Lord.
Yeah.
Pray about this.
How long has this been taking place? I think I saw something here that said 10 years, but tell us a little bit more about the history of what has been happening there at the Comenius School.
Our school started in 1998 as a homeschool co-op, and then just very quickly became a school. And as more and more people found out about it, classes grew. So now we have about 200 students, K through 12, and we start each day with prayer, with student-led prayer and student-led praise and worship. So the very first thing they do when they get out of the car is come into homeroom, and they're immediately, their mindset gets pointed to the Lord.
Let's, if we can, maybe tell people what's available at the website, because, again, this is a new school starting in Dallas, obviously, but there are some around the country. And if somebody is saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about elementary school, middle school, high school, you have all sorts of information at thecomeniusschool.com. So talk about what is on the website for people if they would like to know a little bit more about starting a school or finding out more about it.
If people are interested in starting a school, my staff, faculty actually wrote a book called Kingdom Education, and that has in-depth material for them about our philosophy, what we do, why we don't have homework, how we point children to the Lord, and that can be available through our website. Also, we have a Facebook page, Comenius School for Creative Leadership, which is updated during the school year with events that happen throughout school. But on the website in particular, we have drop-down menu that will point you towards elementary grades, middle school grades, high school grades, a really good about page which talks about our philosophy, and also just admissions packets for international as well as local students.
Very good. Let's take a break. When we come back, if you have some questions, certainly you perhaps do by now, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk about what a typical day might look like. And again, let me hold this up for those of you that are watching online, the Kingdom Education book. And that is one that might get you started to find out a little bit more about whether or not this might be something you'd like to do as well. We'll be right back.
How long have you been listening to Point of View? If this is your first day or two, you get a pass. This one isn't for you. But if you've been around a while, I have a question. Have you ever donated to support what we do? If not, why not? Maybe you really don't know. You never seriously thought about it. Well, please think about it. In fact, take action. Do it now. If you keep coming back, you obviously get something from the program. You've heard how people's lives have been transformed and energized to make a difference. And the only way that we can be here tomorrow and next month and next year is if you break that cycle and give. Please, you can likely do more, but act today and give at least $5. $5. Sure, if you can do 50, do it. If you can do 100, do that. But at least 5. click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kirby Anderson. Continue our conversation today in studio with us, Tracy Eckert, again, co-founder and director of Storehouse, which is a prayer ministry and a house of prayer. And also, of course, we have by phone Sandy Woods, who is a teacher and administrator with the Comenius School for Creative Leadership. And you might be saying, I need to know a little bit more about that. The good news is we have a link on our website. We have information about Kingdom Education. We have a video for you to watch. I would encourage you to watch that video. It's only going to take you a minute or two. Then hit that share button, put it on your Facebook page, and start a conversation. And for those of you, for example, in South Carolina, that's where Sandy Woods is located, and I know maybe you would want to know more about the school there. I know Tracy is starting one here in Dallas, and there are other opportunities as well. And just before we get into kind of what a typical day is like, Tracy, the first question that parents ask, well, that's after how much it costs, but maybe the first question about the program is, are we producing a good educational product? And it sure seems to me that the results are in. We're doing pretty well on that, aren't we?
Well, one of the things, again, that impressed me about this model, this Comenius model, is that our kids go to school 4 days a week, and they have a no homework policy. But what was the bonus is it's a kingdom school, lots of prayer, lots of prophecy, lots of worship, but their kids are being so well educated with in less time and with less heartache. And so they are their school is outperforming schools in a 3-state area while going to school 4 days a week and having no homework. And they have produced Merit Scholar every year. And then Rick Joyner received an award for excellence in education and a standing ovation by the South Carolina House of Representatives and Senate. And so they've found a model that works, and it's a model that was given to a Moravian priest through prayer. And so I really believe that it's the Lord's way. He's saying, listen, I know how kids work. I know how they operate. I know how they think. I know how they grow. I'm going to help you grow your kids, and this is a great way to do it. So that's what excited me about it.
Well, Sandy, I wanted to let Tracy talk about the good things out of your school, because it's always hard for you to brag on your own school, but it does seem to me that you have found something that not only works very well in terms of producing a good educational product and prepares kids for the 21st century, but also really helps them understand through kingdom education who they are in Jesus Christ. And so I think the proof is in the pudding, and it looks like you've been very successful.
Absolutely. You know, you want kids to connect with how God made them. And so Proverbs says, you know, train up a child in the way that they should go. And it's the way that he made them. They have that extra day. They've got Friday. They've got time after school to figure out what God put inside them, what is the way that they should go, and to really pursue that. So that's what we do. We give them the opportunity to connect with what they really would want to do and opportunities to go for it.
Can you give us a little bit of better idea of what is involved in each school day? Of course, you talked about as soon as they get there, you really want to focus on the Lord, but this probably was a surprise to a lot of our listeners. 4 days a week instead of 5, and no homework. How does this work? Can you give us a little better understanding of what that looks like?
So, yes, for us, we do a kind of a modified block schedule. In grades 6 through 12, students will start each day with, like I said, with prayer and praise and worship. Focus on the Lord for about 15 minutes. Off the class, the first class is 2.5 hours long. So there's a lot of activation, a lot of projects, a lot of group work, a lot of thinking. It's really student-centered instead of teacher-centered. And after that first 2.5-hour class, they have every other day they have Bible or PE or speech and debate, then lunch, and then another 2.5-hour class, and then they're done for the day. And they do this for 4 days a week, and on Fridays, that's their day to pursue, to take a college class if they'd like, to take lessons. I have a girl who just won a Gold Key Award through Scholastic, first place for painting. And she said she could never have concentrated on her painting if she didn't have Fridays to do it. So Fridays is a day to really be creative.
Okay, let me ask some of the tough questions. You and Tracy both can kind of jump in as you want to, but one of the questions that certainly comes from a parent is, well, sooner or later they're going to have to take the SAT, they're going to have to take the ACT. The reality is a lot of this Common Core stuff has made its way into the tests. So how do you avoid some of the concerns that many people have about those things that have made their way not into the public schools, but also sometimes in the Christian schools? How do you kind of deal with that particular tension?
Well, I can answer for Tracy because she doesn't have high school yet. Our students take the SAT and the ACTs. They do very well on them. It's because we teach in the classroom everything that they need to know that is on those tests. So we still teach English, math. We present the material that they need, and they're going to do well on the test.
And again, you've got to deal with all the regulations of the various states. You know, in South Carolina, certain things have to be taught and those kinds of things. So you still want to be a legitimate school, but at the same time, you want to avoid some of the mistakes you've seen in the public schools?
Absolutely. So because we are a private school in South Carolina, we don't have to do the end of grade state tests. So we spend less time teaching to the test and more time teaching material and giving students time to really think about what they're learning.
What a concept. Let's teach education instead of teach to the test. Tracy, you're going to have to deal with that in the state of Texas, aren't you?
Yeah, we're going to have to deal with it as well. And when I've been to CSCL Fort Mill several times, and when I went with some other teachers and educators, and from all over the world, really, to find out what is going on and what are these guys doing that's producing these kinds of students, and they all came with the same question. They all said, "What is the curriculum?"
Yes.
What is the curriculum? And all of the teachers and the faculty at CSCL Fort Mill just laughed, and they said, it's really not the curriculum. Because we all know that our children have to learn A, B, and C, right? But it's the culture that they have created that enables a child to actually learn, not just to memorize, but to actually learn material.
One of the advantages, Sandy, is that especially if homeschool, they say, is delight-directed education. That is, if a young child is really into dinosaurs all of a sudden, they're into geology, or they're really artistic and like painting, you can kind of provide some of that. How can you facilitate some of that in your school?
Yes. So if a teacher is allowing projects in the classroom, then a child can take what they're passionate about or what they're gifted in and actually gear that project towards that. It's really very easy. So if a child likes dinosaurs and they're in an English class, then they might be able to write about the dinosaur. In history, they could talk about history, make up a history timeline, prehistoric times. Science, obviously, you've got all kinds of archaeology. So as long as there's freedom in the classroom to be creative, then that student is going to be able to tie their passion into what they're learning.
Sure. Another question I want to have for both of you, and I know there'll be different answers, is the cost. That's one of the questions parents always ask. And obviously, the advantage of the private schools sometimes is they have some resources that they can give. The advantage of the public school is your tax dollars pay for it. But in your situation, obviously, there is a cost. Can you give us a feel for what that looks like?
So in South Carolina, we don't have vouchers. I know in North Carolina they do. However, we do have a scholarship fund at our school that parents can apply to. If they have already been at the school for 1 year, we actually want to know the student first before we grant them a tuition discount. However, we are very good with praying with parents and encouraging them and just saying, hey, if the Lord wants your child here, He is going to give you the means to do it.
Well, and for us, we've really tried to keep the cost down. And so having a school with this model provides that the expenses are lower because they're only going to school 4 days a week.
It's certainly right.
And so we get to benefit from that, and we pass the benefit along to the parents. So we are very competitive with the private school and Christian school marketplace. In fact, we are far beneath the marketplace currently. In fact, you can go online to cscldallas.com, and it has on there all of our tuitions, which are broken down per grade. So we're really excited about offering an affordable, because we want this to be an education for everyone, not just the affluent, but we want it to be an education for everyone.
Very good. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to ask Tracy a little bit about what seems to be sometimes the over-medication of kids that are sitting in schools and some of the things that are happening in the public school, and maybe the fact that we aren't recognizing the diversity of personality. Those of us that were boys in the schools, we're supposed to act like girls, and if we didn't, there were consequences. In the old days, it was a paddle. Now it seems to be a drug. So I'm going to come back and talk about that and get some comments from you. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to join us. Sandy Woods, Tracy Eckert with us. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the Comenius School movement, and again, we are talking with Sandy Woods, who actually helps teach and administrate at the one in South Carolina, Tracy Eckert, starting one here in Dallas, and we'll take some phone calls in just a minute, 1-800-351-1212. But I talked about the fact that sometimes we have kids that are really active, and to have them sit still and to pay attention and, in a sense, lose their creativity because we medicate them or we control them in ways, I think that's not exactly what we need to do. We need to let people use their gifts and abilities. And I think you've got a great quote here from an individual that I think really emphasizes what's being taught in the schools right now.
Yeah, this is a quote from Sir Ken Robinson, who wrote a book called The Element. And he's done a lot of research and promotes a type of model that Comenius is, because he's seen what's happened to our kids in the current school system. And he says this: we have gone from what is essentially an industrial model of education, a manufacturing model, which is based on linearity and conformity and batching people. We have to move to a model that is based more on the principles of agriculture. We have to recognize that human flourishing is not a mechanical process, it's an organic process. And if you cannot predict the outcome of human development, all you can do, like a farmer, is to create the conditions which they will begin to flourish.
Mm. And again, we can't just see kids as cookie cutter kind of situations in an industrial model. And so there's a good example of that. Sandy, I've got a question from one of our listeners here in South Carolina on the Good News Network. So, Will, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Sandy Woods and Tracy Eckert.
Thank you. My question is this. My stepson is autistic and also has Asperger's. How does your system work for a child like this?
We've actually had some great success with children who are high-functioning autistic or have Asperger's. One of the things is to meet with the children and the parents before enrolling in the school and talk about cues that they can use in the classroom with the teacher to avoid anxiety, because they tend to get really anxious when they're in a situation that they can't control. And so we talk about cues. We talk about getting a covenant together between the student and the teachers and just working together with them and the parents to make that school experience really successful for them.
Have you had experience with very many of those kind of students? My son-in-law, stepson rather, he does have some issues, and possibly is going to have to go to MUSC for some help and evaluation down there because of his issues.
Sure. What kind of experience have you had? Sandy?
I'm sorry?
Yes, you just wondered what kind of experience you've had. It's just a few students that you've had?
We're seeing more and more students with high-functioning autism enrolling at the school. So, as I said, we because our classes are small, we kind of covenant between the teachers and the students and the parents to work out a really good plan for each individual student.
Sure.
The ones that we've had a lot of success with have gone on and enrolled in college and are following a normal course of education that any other student would.
Yeah, Tracy, I was just thinking, too, that's one advantage of a smaller group of students. First of all, they're working together. As you said, they're developing behavioral responses, so that's very key. And instead of some of these situations being disruptive, they could be really great teaching moments, couldn't they, within a school?
Well, when I went to Comenius, what I was so impressed with is how the students that are there, they know who they are. And they're very, and they know what they want to do. And so within that network of friendships, they all support one another,
yes.
and they all take personal responsibility for their own behavior, but also their own education. And that's why it's really creative school or school for creative leadership. So they train these children in leadership by letting them lead,
yes.
and letting them lead by helping one another, developing one another, being friends with one another. And when I interviewed all of these children, and I went around, Sandy gave me free reign over the whole school, and I went around and interviewed the kids. What was so surprising is they all said, no matter whether they came from homeschool, public school, or private school, they all said the same thing. We love it here because of how much our friends love us and how much the teachers love us.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just an incredible testimony to the success of that kind of environment. And they're they're top of their class in a 3-state area, So, I mean, it just couldn't be a better recipe for success.
Sandy, I think it comes back to the idea that when people ask about the curriculum, you're asking the wrong question. It's really, what is the culture that you're creating inside the school? Is that a fair statement?
Exactly. Is it a kingdom culture, or is it one that relies so heavily on a scripted curriculum that there's no room for freedom outside of that?
Well, we've got a couple of links, and just before we run out of time, Sandy, first of all, we have the link to the ComeniusSchool.com, and that is the School for Creative Leadership. Mention one more time what's available on that website. This would be helpful for anyone that might be, in your particular case, in South Carolina, wanting to attend that school, or for individuals that say, we would like to start a school like this in our community. This might be a school that we could start in our church. So tell us what we find when we land on your website.
So on my website is a lot of what's going on in this school. It talks about our philosophy and also has application packets for local as well as international students. Let me say this, anyone that wants to start a school could contact me directly. My email address is swoods@morningstarministries.org, and I could talk more about that with them.
Very good. And Tracy, you've just developed your website, so it's available online. And what will they find when they land there?
Well, we have a similar situation, a lot of information about who John Amos Comenius is, our school philosophy, how we feel like this school is going to impact our city, impact Dallas and the families in Dallas, and also registration. You can register online. And all of the tuition arrangements. And so please do visit our website.
Well, Tracy, you're a good friend, and every time you come in with an idea, this one is one I said, okay, she's going to have to do the talking because I've never heard of the Comenius School. And so this is a way to educate me as well as the listeners. So if this is the first time you've heard about it, that's right. This is the first time a lot of us have heard about it, and we thought it would be helpful because what we do right now doesn't seem to be working, and trying to get a different result from doing the same thing again and again, don't we call that definition of insanity? So let's try something else, and this is why we wanted to educate you today about the Comenius School for Christian and Creative Leadership. So all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net, with all the links necessary. So Tracy, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Kirby. As always, it's a pleasure.
Sandy, good to meet you by phone, and next time I'm in South Carolina, I'll try to drop by the school.
Absolutely. Please do. Thanks for having me.
We need to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the Republican National Convention that took place last night. But we also got Thomas DiLorenzo in here and his new book, The Problem with Socialism. In a sense, that's sort of a preview for next week with the Democratic National Convention, especially since you had an individual who did not become the nominee but was runner-up. And that is an individual that called himself a socialist. And many of the things that have ended up in the Democratic National Platform essentially could be called socialism. So we're going to talk to an expert about what is socialism, how can we define it, and doesn't it work or does it not work? And so we're going to spend some time talking with him and, of course, review a few things that were said last night at the Republican National Convention. All of that coming up in the second hour. If you'd like some more information about all the things we've talked about, go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll find my viewpoint section, and you'll find links to the things that we've been talking about in this first hour on the Comenius School. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after these important messages.
If you have been listening, you've probably heard me talking about the power of $5. Someone did a little math around here and discovered if every Point of View listener gave $5 this week, it would keep us on the air for about 3 years, 36 months. That's encouraging, don't you think? I mean, oh, sure, it would be nice if a millionaire stepped up and sent a check with a big number. The reality is all we really need is for everyone, for you, to do something. What I would like you to do today is find 2 friends, encourage them to join you in sending a gift, at least $5, more if you can. Challenge each other. Then the 3 of you go challenge 3 more. Just have everyone click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. You go ahead, do it first. Pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Thank you for doing your part in support of Point of View's $5 challenge. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about socialism. In some respects, it's a setup for what we'll be talking about next week when we get into the Democratic National Convention. Last night, of course, was the second night of the Republican Convention. And I thought, just to kind of set up some of the conversation we would have with our guest, I thought we'd go to at least one of the comments made last night by Dr. Ben Carson, because he had to say a few things, which, by the way, we'll be talking about tomorrow with Dinesh D'Souza, who will be in studio as we talk about his new movie, Hillary's America. But this is what Dr. Ben Carson had to say.
Now, one of the things that I have learned about Hillary Clinton is that one of her heroes, her mentors, was Saul Alinsky. And her senior thesis was about Saul Alinsky. This was someone that she greatly admired and that affected all of her philosophies subsequently. Now, interestingly enough, let me tell you something about Saul Alinsky. He wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. On the dedication page, it acknowledges Lucifer, the original radical who gained his own kingdom. Now, think about that. This is a nation where our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, talks about certain inalienable rights that come from our Creator. This is a nation where our Pledge of Allegiance says we are one nation under God. This is a nation. This is a nation where every coin in our pocket and every bill in our wallet says, "In God we trust." So are we willing to elect someone as president who has as their role model somebody who acknowledges Lucifer? Think about that. The secular progressive agenda is antithetical to the principles of the founding of this nation. And if we continue to allow them to take God out of our lives, God will remove himself from us. We will not be blessed, and our nation will go down the tubes. And we will be responsible for that.
Some of the comments from Dr. Ben Carson last night at the Republican National Convention. We're going to focus some time and attention now on the subject of socialism. There is a new book out. It's published by Regnery, The Problem with Socialism, and it is written by Professor Thomas DiLorenzo, individual that is a professor at Loyola University in Maryland, and also, of course, associated with the Mises Institute. He's written a number of books called Hamilton's Curse, The Real Lincoln, How Capitalism Saved America, and one that we have on our website today, The Problem with Socialism. Professor DiLorenzo, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
I'm pleased to be with you, Kirby.
You know, when you think about whether it's Saul Alinsky or just the fact that, as we'll be talking about a lot next week with the Democratic National Convention, that the younger you are, the more likely you are to accept socialism. The statistics I've seen, 43% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 had a favorable opinion of socialism, and oftentimes think that socialism is preferable to capitalism. So that's one of the reasons I know that you wrote the book.
Yeah, it is. There was another poll that said 69% of the voters under the age of 30 said they could vote for a socialist president. and that's what motivated me to write the book. It's written in plain English, even though I'm a PhD economist. I tried to write this for any high school senior, a young college student could read it, and it has several hundred footnotes, but the text is written in plain English, and it tries to explain why socialism should not be a part of the future of the younger generation, and I do it in 16 chapters.
And I think, again, it's written in such a nice, engaging way. It's kind of a smaller book, so you could get copies of it and hand it to one of your high school or college graduates or anybody else that may be enamored with Bernie Sanders or the idea of socialism. And so, again, what we need to understand is that for a lot of our listeners, they are maybe, especially if they're younger, when they think of socialism, they might think of sort of this utopian Swedish example, and they don't necessarily connect it up with the Soviet Union. And as a matter of fact, as you point out, the Swedish example is not a very good one after all. But most of them are unfamiliar with the fact that perhaps a very important book, one that I devoted an entire week of radio programs to on the Probe website, is the book called The Road to Serfdom. And this is where Hayek was, in a sense, warning individuals after the end of World War II that we would head down the road of socialism, and that oftentimes that road to socialism is paved with good intentions, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's a great book. When Glenn Beck had his television show, he talked about The Road to Serfdom one day, and the next day it went to #1 in sales on Amazon.com. And I immediately put together a 5-week online course through the Mises Institute on it, and I got hundreds of students from all over the world to sign up for it. It's that kind of a book. But one of the things I write about is how in our country today, federal, state, and local governments collect taxes that amount almost to 40% of national income now. It's approaching 40%. And if you add on top of that 75,000 pages of federal regulations in this book called the Federal Register, and then state and local governments regulate, all aspects of business activity locally as well, then we're about half socialist already. So I make the case that our country is at a tipping point where we're about to slide, we could slide downhill in a big way toward even more socialism, and that's not a good thing. And people like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton who keep pointing to democratic socialism, like they should point to countries like Venezuela, which today is imploding economically. Middle-class people are rooting through garbage in the streets looking for food to eat, and they've got hyperinflation. A hamburger costs $160 in Venezuela today, and that's what democratic socialism would do to us, and our young people don't seem to know much about this.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, continue our conversation today as we talk with Professor Thomas DiLorenzo, and again, a professor of economics at Loyola University, also associated with the von Mises Institute. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the problem with socialism, why socialism always and everywhere is an economic disaster. Then look at some of the reasons why people should be concerned about socialism, how sometimes the worst are the ones that rise to the top under socialism. And is socialism at all associated with fascism and Nazi Germany, or is it only associated, say, with communist Russia? And then what about the so-called successful Scandinavian socialist ideas that are talked about, the democratic socialism that Bernie Sanders refers to, and sometimes even Hillary Clinton? And then whether or not socialism is really a good idea, or whether or not it is something that has failed time and time again. Were those just simply programs that were not properly implemented, or at the very root of socialism are there the real seeds of its own destruction? So we've got lots to talk about today. New book out, The Problem of Socialism. It's a handbook that you can put in a backpack, and I think you should, especially if you have a young person today that's convinced that democratic socialism is the answer. I don't think it is, and you'll find out as we continue our conversation about this book right here on Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, 2 weeks ago, the Dallas police used a bomb disposal robot to end the standoff with the cop killer. Does this unprecedented use of a police robot signal a change in the way technology will be used to fight crime in the future? I think that it does. Police departments have been willing to embrace any technological advance that keeps officers safe and helps them be more efficient in fighting crime. A GPS, cameras, and laptops can be found in almost every squad car. Now that the cost of military-grade robots is dropping, it's likely that many police cars in the future might have a robot. Now, the argument for doing this is straightforward. Military-grade robots now are used by bomb squads and are used to keep police and citizens away from danger, either a suspected bomb or a dangerous suspect. Attaching a bomb to a robot was probably the next logical step. On the other hand, there is a concern that I have written about in the past about the militarization of the police. Many of the robots are similar to and even identical to the ones used by the military. Of course, they're very expensive, so it's unlikely they'll be used too often to blow up suspects. It is possible that the use of these robots can save lives. A robot operator can stay a safe distance from a suspect and tell him to drop a weapon. If he fails to comply, a robot could be used to bring non-lethal force like a taser. In many scenarios, it would be hard for an officer to use a taser, especially if the suspect already has a weapon drawn. Fortunately, the police robot ended the confrontation in Dallas without any other officers being killed. Its success guarantees that other police departments will consider using police robots for other such confrontations. That is why we need a debate and a discussion about the use of police robots. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about this new book, The Problem with Socialism. Is published by Regner. You'd probably be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you could get it as well. And Thomas DiLorenzo is with us. And Professor, for just a minute, let's, if we can, maybe talk about the alternative, because sometimes the word capitalism is not well received by the younger generation. You've written a book, How Capitalism Saved America. And it does seem to me that maybe we need to take people back to 1776 and to the wealth of nations, and certainly talk about that, and maybe also remind them that we have been able, as a world, in the various countries of the world, to lift thousands, even millions of people out of poverty due to a free market. But today, I think there are a lot of young people that have a biased view towards capitalism, maybe because you can always expect that in the movies or in television programs, if somebody's a capitalist or a businessman, they're probably going to be the bad guy. So what are we really talking about in terms of an alternative to socialism?
Well, capitalism is simply a voluntary exchange among consenting parties in a free market guided by prices determined by supply and demand. Period. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, his famous book that you mentioned, he put it best. One of my favorite little quotes from that book is he defined capitalism as give me that which I want and I will give you that which you want. And, it's trade and exchange. I think part of the problem is, and one of the themes of my other book, How Capitalism Saved America, is that a lot of people confuse real capitalism with what we call crony capitalism today. And so when the young people see big businesses like Goldman Sachs making bad business decisions and losing billions of dollars, and then the government comes along and bails them out and gives them billions of tax dollars to cover their losses, Well, they're right to complain about that. That's corrupt. That's crony capitalism. But if the proponents of real capitalism, like myself, we've been criticizing and ranting and raving against that for a long, long time. In fact, that was the whole theme of Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations. It was called mercantilism in his day, but today we call it crony capitalism.
Right.
So I think the young people need to just be straightened out on what capitalism really is.
Sure. Let's talk about the appeal of socialism for just a minute. And Chapter 3, you sort of really allude to that. And that is the appeal of socialism, especially for the young people and people around the world sometimes, is, well, everybody should be treated equal. Everybody should have the equal opportunities. So it's kind of this idea of egalitarianism. And so we want kind of to have equality of outcome. But I have made the argument over the years, speaking first in college classrooms and certainly now on radio, that the moment you allow any amount of freedom, you're going to have an inequality of outcomes. So if you have an equality of opportunity, some people are going to be more likely to invest differently. Some people are going to be willing to have more risk. Some people are going to have different kinds of gifts and abilities. Some are going to be focused on the arts and not expect to make a great deal. Others are going to want to go into business and make money. As soon as you allow any level of freedom, it seems to me that human reality prevents the possibility of having equality of outcome. And the only way you can have equality of outcome is when you have a heavy government intrusion to force individuals to give up what they have rightfully earned to give that to others that have not rightfully earned it. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. You know, socialism has never created equality. It creates more inequality than capitalism does. It creates a small political elite at the top that lives lavishly, and then everybody else suffers in equal misery. For example, today, I mentioned Venezuela. Its economy is imploding, but the wealthiest person in the whole country of Venezuela is the 35-year-old daughter of the late Hugo Chavez, who is reportedly worth $4.2 billion with a B, even though she never ran a business or even worked at a job, as far as I know. And that was always true of socialism, that it generates, it creates inequality, not equality.
And in addition to the inequality is, and this gets us to one of your other chapters, why the worst rise to the top under socialism. The sad reality is that this has also been not only a situation in which some become rich, it's also been a situation in which, sadly, masses lose their lives. True?
Yes, it's not just an accident or a coincidence that 20th century socialism saw all these monsters, Stalin and Hitler and Mao Zedong and Castro and people like that. And I quote Friedrich Hayek in my book as having explained that in The Road to Serfdom, that what socialism basically is the forceful imposition of a plan or governmental plans, plural, on the whole society, or at least the attempt to do so, they replace all the individual plans that we all make for our own lives. And they inevitably fail because government is inherently inept and inefficient, but the politicians never admit failure, they never give up. And so whenever they fail, they give themselves more power over us, and we lose more freedom, and that fails again. And so they give themselves more and more power to do more and more damage to us through their attempts at central planning our lives. And so what that means is that the people who rise to the top in that kind of a system are the people who are the most able to abuse their fellow citizens, deny them of their civil liberties, and in the worst cases in the 20th century, commit mass murder. The Black Book of Communism tells us how in the name of socialism, over 100 million people were murdered by their own governments in the 20th century. And these are not wartime deaths. These are just criminal murders by government.
Wow. And some people just a minute ago, Professor DiLorenzo might have just been saying, wait a minute, you mentioned Hitler. I don't consider him to be a socialist, but you do talk about the socialist roots of fascism. And I think it's interesting to recognize that there is a bigger connection. And this is one of the myths, because today what you will oftentimes hear, at least in the mainstream media, is, well, conservatives are like those fascists, like the Nazis. I was like, well, not really. Explain that if you might.
Yeah, I've been called a Nazi for 30 years, being a conservative. But yeah, well, Hitler called himself a socialist. National Socialism is what Nazi stands for, and so that should end any kind of debate over this. But all the leading theorists of fascism started out as socialists, and they were very clear about their condemnation of what was known at the time as classical liberalism, which is conservative ideas. There's a great book by Ludwig von Mises, by the way, called Liberalism. I think it was published in the 1920s. It just lays out all the ideas that evolved over the centuries that are just the ideas of freedom. And in my book, I quote Mussolini himself and I quote Hitler himself as understanding that was their enemy, that was their philosophical enemy, was the ideology of freedom. And I don't want to bore you too much, but there's just one quote from Mussolini himself where he said, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only so far as his interests coincide with the state. It is opposed to classical liberalism. And so he goes on to really criticize economic freedom, personal freedom, civil liberties, and to say we need fascism. And it was just a different version of socialism. And the same was true of the German fascists.
And I might just mention in this book, you've got a number of quotes so that if you find yourself in a discussion or a debate, whether it's on Facebook or a blog or whatever it might be about, somebody says, well, Nazis, well, those are conservatives. No, they were socialists as well. And you need some of these quotes. This is a good book and resource for that. So let's take a break. And when we come back, let me open up the phones. Perhaps you have some comments. So we've already played a piece from Ben Carson speaking last night about Saul Alinsky. And of course, we've been talking with Thomas DiLorenzo about his book entitled The Problem with Socialism. But we'll get back and also try to answer another question that is really an important one, and that is that so often when you hear Bernie Sanders speak or others, they will point to positive examples. They'll say, well, okay, we'll give you Venezuela, we'll even give you maybe China, and we'll give you Russia and a few other places, but let's look to the Scandinavian countries. There's an example of what democratic socialism is and what it needs to be here in America. And so I think you're going to have a chance to hear a little bit more perspective on that. And if you would like to know a little more about this particular book, we, of course, have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. And also, of course, we have a link to Thomas DiLorenzo at the Mises.org website, and that will give you information about him and, of course, all sorts of other links. And if you're interested in the book, we certainly encourage you to look for it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link so that you can get it both in hardcover or in Kindle. And it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. And again, don't forget that tonight will be the third night of the Republican National Convention. We'll play some of the clips and some of the audio from it tomorrow. Friday, of course, we will have our weekend edition. And as we're talking today about people like Saul Alinsky and socialism, don't forget, in studio tomorrow, first hour, Dinesh D'Souza, his new book, and his movie out, Hillary's America. So we have a lot more to talk about, but if you'd like to join our conversation, we'd love to hear you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
How long have you been listening to Point of View? If this is your first day or two, you get a pass. This one isn't for you. But if you've been around a while, I have a question. Have you ever donated to support what we do? If not, why not? Maybe you really don't know. You never seriously thought about it. Well, please think about it. In fact, take action. Do it now. If you keep coming back, you obviously get something from the program. You've heard how people's lives have been transformed and energized to make a difference. And the only way that we can be here tomorrow and next month and next year is if you break that cycle and give. Please, you can likely do more, but act today and give at least $5. $5. Sure, if you can do 50, do it. If you can do 100, do that. But at least 5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Thomas DiLorenzo with us today as we talk about his book, The Problem with Socialism. I might also commend to you his previous book, How Capitalism Saved America. This segment, let's spend some time maybe talking about whether or not democratic socialism in the Scandinavian countries is a good idea. Let's also talk about another issue that many people have said, and that is we have such a problem with our healthcare system. Maybe it just makes more sense for having the government take over all of it. Isn't socialized medicine a better way to go? How about this issue of democratic socialism in the Scandinavian countries? We've heard Bernie Sanders talk about this. We've heard Hillary Clinton talk about this. Yet you talk about the myth of a successful Scandinavian socialism. How so?
Yes, but I think Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are being dishonest when they point to Sweden as some sort of utopia for us. The truth about Sweden is that Sweden had a very capitalistic free market economy in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. They had the highest per capita income growth in the world for 50 years, beginning around 1870. And then the politicians who got in charge around the 1940s and 50s started adopting socialism. They had nationalized a lot of industries. They adopted a big welfare state, heavily progressive income tax, and massive regulation of private business. And as a result, they did finance their welfare state. They sort of ate up all their capital that had been created by all these great Swedish inventors like Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite, and the people who created Volvo and Saab automobiles and so forth. And according to the Swedish Economic Association, they did not create a single net new job in Sweden from the year 1950 until 2005. That's 55 years of no job growth in the country of Sweden. And so they had a bit of an economic implosion in the 1980s as a result of that. And so they tried to save themselves by printing money like crazy to bail themselves out. And they created lots of inflation and 500% interest rates in Sweden. And that led to a sort of a Margaret Thatcher style revolt where they had a new party in charge, privatized a lot of the industries, they cut marginal tax rates, and they deregulated, and they made a comeback. Sweden today still has a per capita income lower than Mississippi, which is our poorest country. So this is hardly a role model for us.
And it's interesting because, and I'm going to use your book for some commentaries, but I've done two commentaries that relate to that chapter. One about the fact that the success of Sweden had a lot to do with the success that happened before it became socialized. Yeah. And the second one is a more recent column where they went back and looked at the GDP of many of these so-called successes and then compared them to the GDPs of the various states. And it's pretty embarrassing when you look at it because lots of times they'll point to Europe and you're going, really? The GDP, the per capita GDP, if you will, the amount of individual income per capita is worse in many of these European countries than in the poorest state that we have in the United States. So you've got some great points in here, and I'm probably going to use those for some of my commentaries. And for those of you that are interested in looking at some of those facts and figures, just simply go to our viewpoint section. You can type in socialism, you can type in per capita GDP, and you'll find some of the things I've written on that. What about another appeal of socialism that Professor DiLorenzo we hear all the time, and that is, well, we need a social, we need a social safety net. We need welfare. We really need socialism if we're going to help the poor. You, in one of your chapters, actually says welfare harms the poor. How so?
Well, yeah, welfare harms the poor, destroys their work incentives, for one thing. For example, Hawaii has the highest level of welfare benefits. And there was a Cato Institute study welfare programs out of about exist, and the average recipient $40,000 a year in cash and in-kind welfare.
I'm kind of losing you here. If we can't get that phone working a little better, we're going to have to try again. Okay. Go ahead. Give us the answer again, because unfortunately we lost you there.
I said that in Hawaii, according to a study by the Cato Institute, welfare recipients in 7 programs only received about $49,000 in government benefits. And that means if they were to get off welfare, they would have to get a job that would maybe pay them $70,000 or $80,000 before taxes. And so it traps people on welfare. There's no incentive to get off of welfare. It breaks up families by replacing fathers with a check. And most of us are pretty familiar with all the pathologies that are created by children who grow up without a family, or without a family and a father in the house. The boys are more likely to end up involved in crime, and the girls are much more likely to have out-of-wedlock births themselves. And so it can be a life-destroying thing. And, of course, you're trapped at a subsistence level of existence when you're on welfare.
And again, you talk about, and quote from Marvin Olasky, who's been on the program with us many times before, the tragedy of American compassion. But let me take another one, because, again, some of the arguments for socialism are, well, we certainly need to have equality of outcome. We certainly need to help the poor. But another one that I hear most often, Thomas DiLorenzo, is that this is probably the only way to really provide quality health care for people in America. Most of the other modern industrialized countries of the world have a single-payer system. So whether you look at the UK, whether you look at Canada, and so really socialized medicine is the way to go. You obviously disagree. Why so?
Well, single payer is sort of a sneaky euphemism for government-run monopoly. If you tell people what this means is a government-run monopoly, and you get an entirely different idea in your head of what this is about, socialized medicine. And in fact, the reality of socialized medicine in other countries is that, it's sort of like, I describe it as all the efficiency of the post office and all the compassion of the IRS, the way that the healthcare system is run. And one of their slogans is healthcare for all, but there are massive shortages in all the countries that have socialized healthcare, because what happens is you tell people it's free and they tend to want all they can get, and that drives the cost up through the roof. And so governments always respond by putting price controls on everything. And one of the things that does is it chases all the doctors away, all the best doctors. You tell them, we're only going to pay you what a bus driver makes. In fact, an old friend of mine who grew up in Russia but who lives here now said in Soviet socialism, the doctors were paid less than bus drivers. And so that's called the brain drain. The best and the brightest will leave. And so you end up with shortages of just about everything. In Canada, for example, I quote a statistic of hundreds of people die from colon cancer because they're put on a 300-day waiting list after they've been diagnosed with colon cancer. And there are similar things that happen with heart disease in Canada, New Zealand, England, wherever they have socialized medicine. And so, they don't have health care for all. And I think a lot of people forget that, we do have health care for all. If an illegal immigrant comes into Texas and gets hit by a car, he'll be taken care of in the hospital. It's illegal for the hospital to turn him down. It's not a great system. It's not a perfect system, but we do treat everybody.
And again, one of the stories that we hear, especially when we had the debate about the Affordable Care Act known as Obamacare, is that, well, yeah, but I've been in Canada and, I broke my leg, or I, had a scrape, or I was in a car accident and I went right in. It was free. I didn't have to pay anything. And actually the problem is that, let's use Canada as an example. Yes, if you're going in and you're dealing with sort of minor surgery, bone breaks, whatever, yeah, the system works very well. But as you also point out in the book, in Canada, because of that, one study found that 876,000 people were waiting for treatments. And so, as you point out, sometimes they wait for treatment so long they simply die. So if you have a minor need, you've got a cold or something like that, it's a really pretty good system. But boy, if you need kidney dialysis, if you need some kind of cardiac treatment, you need any kind of transplant, well, you're in a lot of trouble there. So let's take a break. We'll come back, and if you'd like to join our conversation, I know this is one where you sort of just sit back and listen today, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Thomas DiLorenzo with us for a few more minutes, and again, we'll be watching the Republican convention tonight and play a lot more tomorrow as we have allocated a little more time to listen to, especially the speech by Ted Cruz. I got a feeling there's going to be a lot of great quotes we're going to want to pick up there, so we'll certainly certainly give you that opportunity. And as I mentioned before, we also on Friday will have a complete roundup of what happened at the Republican National Convention. And this interview we're doing today with Thomas DiLorenzo kind of gets us ready for some of the things I suspect we'll be hearing next week at the Democratic National Convention. We've already pointed out, and I've pointed this out in some of my commentaries, that many people say that this Democratic platform is perhaps the most liberal ever before, and is due in large part to the influence of the delegates to Bernie Sanders, who have actually moved the platform further to the left than even what it was 4 years ago. So we'll give you an opportunity to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Tonight, the Republican Convention deals with Make America First Again. The first night was Make America Safe Again. Last night, Make America Work Again, Make America First Again, and then, of course, Make America One Again. We're going to probably play a lot of clips tomorrow because we'll hear from Indiana Governor Mike Pence, who's the vice presidential nominee. We'll also have a chance to hear from Newt Gingrich, from Ted Cruz. The list goes on and on. We'll also probably play some of the pieces from Chris Christie we didn't have a chance to play today, and we'll spend a fair amount of time going through some of those tomorrow. But, of course, first hour, we're going to have Dinesh D'Souza in studios. We talk about his new book, Hillary's America. Let's take some phone calls. We'll head to Georgia first. John on the Good News Network. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Kirby, talking about worker shortages and socialism. I've been running businesses in Georgia and South Carolina for a number of years, and I already experienced worker shortages, and even offering people $40,000 to $50,000 per year for positions that don't require a technical degree or a college degree, you still find worker shortages. So I can only imagine what it's going to be if we have even more social.
And John, I wonder if sometimes the worker shortages here are because of the welfare system, because in some respects that's kind of partial socialism, because I've done some calculations, and you can find some of my commentaries where they were pointing out that, and this may not apply in Georgia, but let me use Maryland because I use that as an example. You have to make a very significant income, and you have to be paid a lot for it to even justify you leaving the home. Because if you're like a single mom with a child and you have all these benefits, those benefits in kind make it an enormous disincentive to go out and work, to be a secretary or a teacher or anything else, because you actually have more benefits, not necessarily income, but, benefits that come to you, that you would almost have to be making 1.5 times the salary of some of those starting salaries in education and secretarial work. So, Thomas DiLorenzo, isn't that part of the reason why even in Georgia, John is having difficulty providing and getting enough workers in his particular business?
Sure. Like in Mississippi, the lowest income state, the one study I alluded to earlier by the Cato Institute said in people who qualify for just 7 government programs, welfare programs, get about almost $19,000 in government benefits. And so you'd have to get a job that pays, $30,000 a year to make it worthwhile in Mississippi to get off the welfare. And so people just don't want to do it. And another thing is, after the crash of '08, they kept extending and extending unemployment insurance. And so what happens when you do that is people just stay out of work longer because they can get along okay. They don't make 100% of what they're making, but they make enough in a lot of states, and they just stay out of work and they don't want to take a job.
Sure.
And the politicians take credit for it, but it creates higher unemployment.
So, John, again, what you're experiencing, if you think it's bad now, it would be even worse if we turn it into a total socialist economy. Well, John, thank you for calling today, and let's see if we can maybe just get to another issue, because I know another one John might be dealing with is this whole idea of minimum wage. I'm not against the idea of making sure that we pay people appropriately, but now that, especially in the Democratic Party platform, have a $15 an hour minimum wage, you have to recognize that it just puts, I think, the lowest rung on the ladder so high that it's going to guarantee all sorts of additional unemployment for especially teenagers who really need some work experience to then justify being paid that level. Don't you think?
Yeah, that's the whole point. It's the labor unions who are, a big part of the Democratic Party who want this primarily. And because it prices out of the job market non-union labor. For example, if I wanted to get my house painted, I could hire 2 college kids. Maybe I'll pay them $10 an hour each, so that's $20 an hour. Or I can hire a professional adult unionized painter who makes $20 an hour too. And so I'm indifferent. It costs me the same thing. But if the government says I have to pay the 2 college kids $15 an hour, well, now it costs me $30 an hour to have them do the job. So I'll hire the more experienced unionized painter to paint my house. And the unions have understood this from the very beginning, that the minimum wage is a useful tool in pricing out of jobs, pricing out of the market, non-union competition. And I think that's the major impetus. And then, of course, they have if you get on the website of the Democratic Socialists of America, you have sort of the crazy wing of the Democratic Party who refuses to acknowledge economic common sense. But yeah, it'll cause a lot of unemployment. But my point is, a lot of it is intended.
Well, and again, let's take that for just a minute, because if you go to the Socialist Party USA or the Democratic Socialist of America, they've been calling for some time a $15 minimum wage, what they call a living wage. Well, now that's actually one of the planks of the Democratic Party platform, which we're going to talk about next week. So what before was seen as a fringe idea, or an idea that showed up in Seattle and a few other places, Berkeley. I mean, you expect sometimes that's going to happen in some of these liberal havens, where I grew up originally. But now it's part of the party platform. So that just shows you how much further left this party platform has moved in just 4 years. It's very different than the party platform, the Democratic Party platform in 2012. The party platform for the Democratic Party, which we'll talk about next week for 2016, is actually parroting lots of things that you see on the Democratic Socialist website, which I think is pretty amazing to me.
Yes, quite a few members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, belong to Democratic Socialists of America. And it's very telling, isn't it, that a few weeks ago, Chris Matthews interviewed Hillary Clinton, and he asked her, what is the difference between a modern-day Democrat and a socialist? He asked her twice, and she refused to answer.
Yeah.
And she's no political dummy, and she didn't want to alienate a big chunk of her party who would answer that question saying, well, there is no difference.
Well, again, one of the heads of the Republican Democratic Party has also been asked that and don't get the same answer. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on. And in some respects, we could have done it next week during the Democratic platform debates and some of the speeches. But thank you for joining us this week to kind of give us a preview of what's going to happen next week. So Thomas DiLorenzo, let me again encourage people to find out more about your book, The Problem with Socialism, or your previous book, How Capitalism Saved America. It's been a delight to have you on the program. Let's do it again sometime.
Okay, Kirby, thank you very much, and have a great day.
All right. Let me encourage you to find some of the information that we've been talking about today. And if you have a young person that is really kind of bought into socialism, and that seems to be the statistics we're finding right now, a very high percentage of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 have a favorable opinion of socialism. And a Pew Research Foundation poll just found that 69% of voters under the age of 30 expressed a willingness to vote for a socialist president for the United States. We saw that with Bernie Sanders. I think we're going to see that next week as we talk about the Democratic National Convention. So that is certainly one of the reasons we wanted to cover this today. Let me just mention that tonight will be another focus on the Republican Convention. Dinesh D'Souza will be with us the first hour. The second hour we're going to devote to listening to, again, some of those very important quotes. There were some really good things said by Chris Christie. I thought I'd just save those for tomorrow. We'll certainly hear some from Newt Gingrich, from Ted Cruz, and from Mike Pence. I'm not sure how we'll get it all in, but we will do our best. And if we don't cover them on Thursday, guess what? We'll cover them on Friday when Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford will be in studio. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things we've talked about today, we've talked about the Comenius School, we've talked about socialism, and we've played just a few clips from the Republican Convention. And if you say, I want to learn a little bit more about some of this, you can find it on our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget that we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring these programs to you. And we're suggesting that some of you, if you've just never supported this ministry before, could you maybe just send $5? That would be a way of saying, well, I believe in what you're doing, and it's certainly a way to hear from you and know that you appreciate listening to this program. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow with Dinesh D'Souza.
If you have been listening, you've probably heard me talking about the power of $5. Someone did a little math around here and discovered if every Point of View listener gave $5 this week, it would keep us on the air for about 3 years, 36 months. That's encouraging, don't you think? I mean, oh, sure, it would be nice if a millionaire stepped up and sent a check with a big number. The reality is all we really need is for everyone, for you, to do something. What I would like you to do today is find 2 friends, encourage them to join you in sending a gift, at least $5, more if you can. Challenge each other. Then the 3 of you go challenge 3 more. Just have everyone click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. You go ahead, do it first. Pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Thank you for doing your part in support of Point of View's $5 challenge. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.